Good morning, AWS, and welcome to the AWS Morning Brief for July 15th, 2019. I'm Corey Quinn, cloud economist for the Duckbill Group, where I help companies improve their AWS bills by making them smaller and less horrifying. The New York City Summit was last week, and with it came a lot of announcements. But first, I'll be in Portland, Oregon, fake Portland for those of us who grew up in Maine, later this week. If you're around, let me know. If you have a company in Portland upon whom you'd like to inflict my AWS Roundtable Q&A, song and dance, let me know. I'm thrilled to entertain people with stories from the cloud. This episode has been sponsored by Influx Data. You might think of an influx of data as a storage challenge, but nay. It's a company. Known for InfluxDB, they've got a few other things that I'll be mentioning a bit later on, or if you're impatient, you can visit influxdata.com before I get there. Now, before I dive into the litany of updates over the past week, I want to talk a little bit about Werner's keynote. For those who didn't see it, Amazon CTO Werner Vogels gave a keynote and was interrupted several times by protesters decrying AWS's contracts with ICE, America's Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Department. Issues around this are always nuanced and difficult to grapple with. I make it a point not to get political in public, and I maintain that position now because I don't believe that don't separate children from their parents and place them in detention camps is a political issue. Rather, it's one of humanity. Werner's statement in response was, "We can have a conversation about this, but let me finish talking first." Okay, that is a fair ask. The keynote's over now, so let's have that conversation. Now, let's talk about releases. The AWS Cloud Development Kit, or CDK, has become generally available, and terrific. That's another way of being able to wrap your head around CloudFormation. Now you can use SAM, you can use the Amplify framework, you can use raw CloudFormation, you can use CDK, or you can do sensible things and not use CloudFormation at all and stick with Terraform. The choice is yours, and now there's more ways to get it wrong than ever before. Amazon Aurora with PostgreSQL compatibility supports serverless. There are 7 words in the title to that post, and 5 of them are the name of the product. So I lost interest long before I got to the payoff. Amazon ECS now offers improved capabilities for local testing, which, great, you can run a cloud service locally and mock their services. Look, if you need to mock cloud services, just do what I did. Start a podcast. AWS's Amplify framework now supports adding AWS Lambda triggers for auth and storage events. Well, that sure beats adding Lambdas just to make Cognito work properly inside of Amplify due to its crappy CloudFormation support. They did that. That's how Cognito and authentication works within Amplify. It fires off a Lambda to hit endpoints that are not supported in CloudFormation. Oof. The AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio Code is now generally available. I've got to say, I think that Visual Studio Code is one of the best things to come out of Microsoft in a decade. It surpassed my love of VI or Vim. It's gone way beyond what I expected a Microsoft product to be able to do. I've even gotten it working badly on an iPad. I am thrilled to see more companies, even direct competitors, start to support it. AWS Code Build has added support for polyglot builds. In other words, you can now have multiple languages in the same product as a part of a build process. That's terrifying. AWS Config now enables you to provision config rules across all AWS accounts in your organization, making the line between service control policies and config rules even more blurry than it already was. Amazon Elasticsearch Service has increased data protection with automated hourly snapshots at no extra charge. Or you can use something like Chaos Search and store your data in S3 with Elasticsearch compatibility for a tenth of the cost with full S3 lifecycle versioning and data protection built in there. Now, Chaos Search is not sponsoring this episode. I just like them. But you know who is sponsoring this episode? That's right. InfluxDB is obviously the time series database that everyone thinks of when it comes to either Influx Data's products or a time series database at all, but they've got way more to offer than that. Telegraph for metrics collection, chronograph for visualization, capacitor for real-time streaming, and yeah, of course, they're provider agnostic, but since people's production workloads live on AWS, they support it extensively and thoroughly. What's more is that all of their offerings are offered both as open source solutions as well as hosted SaaS versions. Check them out at influxdata.com and see if you might have a problem that would benefit from a sudden influx of influx. My thanks to them for sponsoring this episode of the AWS Morning Brief. They announced something called AWS for FluentBit as a part of container services. It's a log router that lets you route logs to S3, CloudWatch logs, some vendors with dollar signs in their eyes that charge an enormous pile of money to store your logs and ingest them. But wait, I already mentioned CloudWatch logs already. It also supports third parties. They came out of left field and introduced something called Amazon Event Bridge last week. People have been asking for things like this for a while, but there have been no real leaks around anything like it. It serves as an event bus that you can integrate with third-party systems. PagerDuty is a good example of that, or natively inside of your own applications. So event-based architectures now become a lot more feasible without having to strictly use AWS offerings. Their secrecy around this was great. They didn't let media find out about this in advance, nor did they let the tagging team at AWS find out about it or the CloudFormation team. Nice job. We can use this for interesting and amazing things as long as we're prepared to instrument it by hand. Nice job. I kid, mostly, but you have to understand that that's a little on the strange side because there's so much awesomeness in the serverless world, but no one sensible is wiring stuff together by hand. So despite the fact that this is generally available, until this changes with CloudFormation support, it really isn't quite done yet. However, CloudFormation hasn't been sitting there with their fingers in their ears ignoring people. AWS Elemental Media Live now supports it as of this week. Good work. I promise that's a real service and not one I made up, although honestly, I couldn't tell you what it does for love or money if you paid me. AWS RoboMaker has announced support for robot operating system Melodic. Now, I have no earthly idea what the hell that is, but I bet it's got a lovely singing voice. Amazon CloudWatch Anomaly Detection has been launched into preview. What this does is it looks at CloudWatch metrics, looks for things that are different and deviate from the norm, and then alerts on them. Now, that's super boring and sounds like something that could be done relatively straightforward with a typical regression analysis, but hang on, it's 2019 and you've got to get people excited. That's right, they're calling it a machine learning service. There we go, now you can pour money into it. This is kind of neat. In other words, it looks over time at your usage patterns and starts to figure out what expected behaviors look like. From there, it winds up figuring out what abnormal starts to look like. I'm not sure I would trust it out of the gate, but I would absolutely experiment with it heavily and see how well it works. Like any Amazon service, I expect it to get rapidly better now that it's been released. Near and dear to my heart, they've announced AWS Budgets Reports. AWS budgets are a great hidden gem that no one knows exists because people like to forget there is an AWS bill, if at all possible. But what this does is it tracks what you're spending, how much data you're using in the course of a month, etc. All these various items you can metric against. And it can now send scheduled emails to you that, let's be honest, you're going to ignore, but you'll get the emails anyway, telling you how closely you're tracking what you've already spent and what your projected spend for the end of the month is likely to look like. And you can get those quarterly, you can get them monthly, you can get them daily is what I'm doing now and getting way too much email. But my life is AWS because I make terrible life choices. They announced Amazon CloudWatch Container Insights back at KubeCon in Barcelona. And what they've now announced in preview is that Container Insights now works on ECS and Fargate as well. More or less what this does is similar to application insights. It gathers what's going on inside of your containerized application and starts to surface things that might be useful. CloudWatch Log Insights does something similar to this as well. Now that it goes beyond just Kubernetes into things that a grown-up might use, like ECS or Fargate, it's going to start being used in more places. Still in preview, but keep an eye on it. I'm very curious on this. Large match support for Amazon GameLift is now available, and I'm not sure what the point of that is. I mean, how large of a match do you really need when you can simply use a butane lighter instead? There are new AWS public data sets available from Yale, Allen Institute for Brain Science, NOAA, others, and Facebook. I'm astonished by that. Facebook usually hoovers up data and gives absolutely nothing back in return. They're basically a criminal enterprise at this point, and just this week had a record-setting $5 billion fine levied against them. That is so immaterial to how much money Facebook makes that when this was announced, their stock price rose and their market cap increased by more than $5 billion. Good work. You can optimize cost with Amazon EFS, Infrequent Access Lifecycle Management. Picture a strange combination between what EFS Infrequent Access was before, which just looks for files that are not being used and transitions them automatically, and lifecycle policies in S3. You can start scheduling things regardless of access patterns now to start aging out into infrequent access approaches. There are decent reasons to do this. It's worth digging into if you're making heavy use of EFS and starting to see the bill creep up. AWS Systems Manager Session Manager has launched Run As to start interactive sessions with your own operating system user account. That's a welcome change. It used to just give you effectively what amounted to an SSH-style session as root on an application. It turns out not everyone wants to be able to give root to anyone who has access to that service, so this helps be a bit more granular. I'm not going to knock it. That's the right direction. What I am going to knock them for is the next announcement. AWS Systems Manager Session Manager has launched tunnels support for SSH and SCP, which is a file transfer protocol that runs over SSH. But you can tunnel a lot of things over SSH, like X11, which is effectively a graphical window displaying approach. It's a window manager that you can run on top of X11 as well. So technically, you can now do that and use AWS Systems Manager, Session Manager, Tunnel Manager, Window Manager. Good work. The Management Tools blog has mentioned that you can use Atlassian Opsgenie with AWS Systems Manager to run the EC2 rescue tool. So yes, you too can now use a third-party tool to leverage a systems management tool to fire off a CLI tool. You really don't want to think about this one too hard unless you want to get extremely depressed about the entire state of our industry. And that's a wrap for this week's episode of AWS Morning Brief. I'm Corey Quinn, cloud economist for the Duckbill Group. And if you have an AWS bill that's terrifyingly expensive to you, we can help. Go to lastweekinaws/services to learn more. I'm Corey Quinn. I'll talk to you next week.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.